What would you do if you saw a wealthy man forcing his maid to kneel in public, right in the middle of a busy American street? Would you turn your head and pretend it wasn't happening, or would you feel that fire inside telling you that this was simply too much to ignore? Scenes like this make us question not just the arrogance of the rich, but the silence of those who witness it. And today, you're about to step into a story where pride, cruelty, and power collide with dignity, courage, and an unexpected act of kindness that changed everything. Stay with me until the end, because what happens here may surprise you. It was a late afternoon in downtown Chicago. The sidewalks crowded with people leaving work, yellow cabs honking as traffic crawled through the intersection, and store windows glowing as evening began to settle in. Right there, under the neon lights and the restless rush of the city, stood Richard, a millionaire dressed in an immaculate suit, leaning against his black luxury car. His polished shoes and expensive watch spoke louder than his words. He was a man used to control, a man who believed money gave him the right to humiliate anyone who crossed him. And at his side, trembling and exhausted after a long day of work, was Mary, his maid. Her uniform was plain, her hair tied back quickly that morning before leaving home, and in her eyes there was both weariness and pride, the quiet strength of someone who works tirelessly, not for herself, but for the family. Waiting at home, but then came the order, cold, sharp, designed not to correct but to destroy. Kneel, right here, now. Can you imagine the sting of those words, not whispered in private, but shouted in front of strangers? People stopped, some gasped, others froze in disbelief, and Mary, caught between the need to keep her job and the unbearable humiliation of bowing to this demand, stood paralyzed. Have you ever been through this? When your dignity is put on trial and you feel the weight of every eye around you pressing against your skin? Richard didn't care. In fact, he relished the spectacle. He raised his voice louder, repeating his command, almost as if the attention of the crowd fed his ego. In that moment, he wasn't just a man giving an order. He was turning a woman's life into entertainment, a cruel show of power. The sound of traffic faded, the chatter of pedestrians died down, and all that remained was the tension between a millionaire who believed himself untouchable and a maid who silently battled tears. And here's where the story takes a turn you might not expect. Because while most people stood watching, unsure whether to intervene, one man didn't hesitate. His name was John, an ordinary passerby, dressed simply, carrying nothing but the quiet confidence of someone who knows the difference between right and wrong. He saw the arrogance, the injustice, the public attempt to strip another human being of her dignity, and he couldn't stay silent. What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because John wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, and he certainly wasn't looking for a fight. Yet, in that moment, he became the voice Mary didn't have, the shield she desperately needed, and the mirror that forced Richard to confront the ugliness of his own actions. And so, with every eye on him, John took a step forward. The crowd shifted, whispers spread, and phones were raised, recording every second. This wasn't just about a maid and her boss anymore. This was about justice, courage, and the raw question of how far one man's pride could go before it came crashing down. Stay with me, because what happened next would not only expose Richard in front of everyone, but would also remind us all of something powerful, that wealth can buy many things, but it can never buy respect. And the moment John spoke, the balance of power in that street began to change. And maybe this is the part where I should pause and ask you something directly. As you imagine that moment, Mary standing there, Richard shouting, and John stepping in, what would you have done if you were in that crowd? Would you have spoken up, or would you have hesitated like so many others did? If this thought stirred something inside you, I'd love to hear it. Share your feelings in the comments below, because your voice matters here just as much as John's did on that street. When you take a second to write what you think, it doesn't just stay between us. It builds a community of people who care about stories like this, who believe that dignity, respect, and courage still matter. And if you're nodding along, if this scene already feels bigger than just a story, then go ahead and tap that like button. It may seem like a small action, but it's what tells me that these narratives are worth bringing to life, that they resonate with you in ways words alone can't capture. And of course, if you want to keep walking with me through stories like this, tales of contrast, injustice, but also of hope and redemption, then make sure you subscribe. That one step means you'll never miss the next lesson, the next twist, the next reminder that humanity still shines in the most unexpected places. More than numbers, your subscription is a way of saying, yes, I believe these stories should keep being told. So stay close, stay with me here, because the most powerful part of this story is just about to unfold. John's words, Richard's reaction, and the crowd's awakening, all of it is building towards something you won't want to miss. The city was alive in that restless way only Chicago could be at rush hour. The streets pulsed with energy, the air filled with the hum of engines, snippets of conversations, and the sharp whistle of a police officer trying to move traffic along the congested avenue. Storefronts glowed with neon signs, advertisements for everything from luxury watches to discount sneakers, creating a backdrop of contradiction, glamour and grit, excess and necessity, all layered on top of one another like the city itself. The air smelled faintly of roasted peanuts from a street vendor mixed with the exhaust of idling taxis. It was a place where thousands of lives intersected without ever truly touching, each person caught in their own journey, their own decisions, their own hidden truth. And right there, on the corner of Michigan Avenue, a moment was unfolding that would cut through the noise and force complete strangers to stop in their tracks. Richard, the millionaire, stood tall, his posture crisp, his polished shoes planted firmly on the pavement as if the ground itself owed him respect. His sleek black car gleamed behind him, its chrome edges catching the fading light. Even his cufflinks reflected authority, little symbols of success that whispered of boardrooms, power lunches, and deals made behind closed doors. People glanced at him and instantly knew. This was a man used to being in charge, a man who carried himself like the world bent to his will. At his side, however, stood Mary. Her uniform was simple, its once bright fabric faded from endless washes. A few threads had begun to fray at the edges of her sleeves, subtle reminders of years of work that demanded more than they ever gave back. She carried herself with quiet strength, but in that moment her hands shook slightly, betraying the storm of emotions she was trying to contain. Her eyes avoided the crowd, staring instead at the cracked pavement beneath her shoes, as if searching for a way to disappear into the ground. Richard's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "On your knees, Mary. Don't make me repeat myself." His tone carried not just anger, but an unsettling pride, as though humiliating her would reaffirm his own power. People nearby froze, their steps halting mid-stride. A mother holding her child's hand pulled the little one closer, shielding them from the tension. A young couple whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Richard's imposing figure and Mary's trembling frame. And then there were those who did nothing at all, people who stared for a moment before lowering their heads and walking faster, choosing silence over involvement. Mary's lips parted as if to protest, but the words caught in her throat. "Please, Mr. Richard, not here," she whispered, her voice so soft it nearly drowned under the city's noise. Yet those close enough to hear it felt the weight of desperation behind her plea. But Richard only raised his chin higher. "You made a mistake. This is how you'll learn. Do it now." His words were drenched in arrogance, every syllable heavy with the belief that money bought him the right to control another person's dignity. The city seemed to pause. Even the traffic sounded muted for a moment, as though the world itself leaned in to witness. And in that silence, tension thickened in the air, like fog before a storm. The contrast was unbearable. The millionaire framed by symbols of wealth, and the maid, a woman who had given her days to serve others, now forced to fight for the scraps of her pride. The bystanders felt it. This wasn't just about an argument between an employer and an employee. It was about something deeper, something that spoke to every hidden truth people try to ignore. The kind of truth that reveals how easily power can be twisted, how fragile dignity can feel when someone else tries to strip it away. Some people in the crowd looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, wanting to help, but afraid of the consequences. Others watched with curiosity, as though this was just another piece of street theater, detached from their own lives. And then, like a thread pulled through the fabric of the moment, one man moved. John had been walking home from work, his worn jacket zipped against the chill in the air, a backpack slung over his shoulder. He wasn't dressed in expensive clothes, and he didn't carry the air of authority that Richard projected, but his steps were steady, and his eyes carried something stronger than wealth, conviction. He slowed as he approached, taking in the scene with a frown that deepened with each passing second. He glanced at Mary, then at Richard, then back at the gathering crowd. "Is this really happening?" he muttered under his breath, almost in disbelief. His words weren't meant for anyone in particular, yet the woman standing next to him heard and nodded faintly, her eyes wide. The moment John stopped walking, the energy shifted. People who had been frozen began to turn, watching him as if silently asking what he would do. The story wasn't his, but something inside him refused to let it go. He had seen arrogance before, seen how wealth and power could blind people to the humanity of others. And now, standing in front of him, was a perfect picture of that truth, laid bare in the middle of a city street. Richard, noticing the movement, narrowed his eyes. "Keep walking," he snapped, his voice carrying the same authority he had used on Mary. "This doesn't concern you." But John didn't move. He set his backpack down gently at his feet, as though signaling that he wasn't going anywhere. "It concerns everyone who still believes respect isn't something you can take away," he said, his voice calm but firm. The crowd murmured, the tension rippling outward. For the first time, Richard's expression faltered, just slightly, like a crack forming in a mask. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge him, not here, not now, and certainly not someone who looked like John. But arrogance is fragile when faced with courage, and everyone watching could sense it. Mary looked up, her eyes meeting John's for a fleeting moment. In them, he saw exhaustion, shame, and a flicker of gratitude, all tangled together. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. Her silence was enough to tell him that this wasn't just about a single order. It was about a long journey of moments where her dignity had been chipped away piece by piece. The street seemed different now. Neon signs still buzzed, traffic still moved, but the focus had shifted entirely. It wasn't just a scene of humiliation anymore. It was a revelation. It was the moment where the balance of power began to tilt, where the arrogance of one man was tested against the courage of another. And in that fragile space between action and reaction, the entire crowd waited to see what would happen next, each heartbeat echoing the same unspoken question: how far would Richard go, and how far would John be willing to stand in his way? Richard had always been the kind of man who measured his worth by the shine of his shoes and the weight of his wallet. From the outside, his life looked flawless. Penthouse views of the Chicago skyline, a collection of luxury cars that rotated like seasonal fashion, tailored suits that seemed to whisper his status before he even opened his mouth. People at the country club knew him as the one who always arrived late, but made sure everyone noticed when he entered. His conversations were full of numbers, deals, and accomplishments, each story crafted to highlight his success. To strangers, he was impressive. To those who worked for him, he was unbearable. There was a hidden truth behind his perfectly polished image. Richard wasn't just obsessed with wealth, he was addicted to power. He craved the feeling of being obeyed, of seeing others bend to his decisions without question. Control was his currency, and he spent it lavishly on those he believed were beneath him. His employees whispered about his temper, about the way he could smile in public while tearing someone apart behind closed doors. He wasn't just arrogant, he had mastered the art of disguising cruelty as leadership. On that evening in Chicago, every part of his posture screamed superiority. He stood with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his chin tilted ever so slightly upward, as though even the air around him had to respect his presence. The streetlights bounced off the silver of his watch, a detail he made sure was always visible when speaking. To Richard, appearances were not just important, they were everything. If he looked powerful, then he was powerful. If others looked small in comparison, then he felt bigger. Mary had worked for him long enough to recognize his patterns. She knew when his voice was building toward a storm, when his jaw tightened just before an outburst. That day, all it took was a minor mistake, a coffee order delivered late, a shirt not pressed to his impossible standards, or perhaps just the frustration of a deal gone sour to set him off. For Richard, her errors were not simple accidents, they were opportunities to reinforce his dominance. "Do you even understand the meaning of respect, Mary?" he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He didn't care that people were watching. In fact, he thrived on it. Public humiliation was a stage for him, and the crowd his unwilling audience. "Kneel, right now. Show everyone that you know your place." The words dripped with venom, but also with satisfaction. To him, forcing her down was a performance, a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the theater of his ego. The stranger's stares didn't make him falter, they fed him. In his mind, this was a moment of impact, one where he could prove, not just to Mary, but to every onlooker, that he was untouchable. What Richard never realized was how fragile this performance really was. Behind his arrogance lay insecurity, fears he would never confess, the kind of quiet doubts that gnawed at him during the sleepless hours of the night. He lived in constant comparison, always looking for someone else to overshadow, always measuring his success against those around him. The truth he tried so hard to bury was simple. His power only existed when others surrendered theirs. And now, with Mary frozen in silence and the crowd holding its collective breath, Richard felt unstoppable. He didn't see her as a person with a life, with dreams, with a family waiting at home. He saw her only as a reflection of himself, a prop to display his superiority. He believed her silence confirmed his control, when in reality it was fear and necessity that held her still. A man like Richard lived for these moments. He had built an entire mindset around dominance, convincing himself that kindness was weakness, that compassion was a flaw. When he looked at people like Mary, he didn't see resilience or sacrifice. He saw an opportunity to remind himself of his own importance, and yet, beneath the arrogance, he couldn't imagine a reality where someone would dare to challenge him. That was his blind spot, the flaw in his carefully constructed armor. "Do it," he repeated, his voice louder now, demanding obedience with every syllable. His words echoed against the glass of storefront windows, bouncing back like a commandment. Some in the crowd lowered their eyes, ashamed to witness it, while others stared in disbelief. Richard's performance was working. He believed the silence around him was proof of his control. He didn't see that the silence was shifting, thickening, building towards something he couldn't control. Mary's voice broke through the tension, barely audible. "Mr. Richard, please." "Not here." Her plea was small, almost invisible against the weight of his command, but it carried the raw edge of someone fighting to hold onto their last thread of dignity. Richard smirked, as if her words were nothing more than a confirmation of his victory. "Exactly here," he said. "This is the lesson." In that moment, Richard wasn't just a man on a busy street. He was the embodiment of unchecked arrogance, the symbol of how easily power can corrupt when left unchallenged. His downfall hadn't arrived yet, but the cracks in his image were already forming. And as the crowd grew restless, as whispers spread from one stranger to another, the transformation of this moment was already underway. It was no longer just about Richard and Mary. It was becoming something larger, a revelation about power, respect, and the courage it takes to break silence. The hidden truth was that Richard's story, polished and proud as it seemed, was about to unravel in ways he never expected. And standing just a few feet away, John was watching closely, ready to step into the space Richard believed he owned. The balance was shifting, the crowd beginning to sense it. And for the first time, Richard's certainty would be tested in front of everyone. Mary had always carried herself with a quiet resilience that few people ever noticed. She wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention when she entered a room, nor the kind who spoke loudly just to be heard. Her presence was softer, marked by the steady rhythm of hard work and the kind of sacrifices that never made headlines but built entire lives in the shadows. At 42, she had seen enough of life to know that dignity didn't always mean standing tall. It sometimes meant enduring, keeping your head down when the storm raged, and surviving one day at a time. Her uniform was neatly pressed when she left home that morning, though it bore the faded signs of countless washes. A single silver pin kept her hair swept back, the same one her daughter had given her years ago as a birthday gift. She wore it not for style, but as a reminder that every early morning shift and late-night task had a purpose. Keeping food on the table, paying for school supplies, covering the bills that seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. Behind her tired smile was the hidden truth of her journey, that she was the backbone of a small family trying to make ends meet in a world that seemed designed to test her limits. Mary never thought of herself as a victim. She had endured too much to let herself wear that label, but she knew the weight of vulnerability. She understood how easily life could tilt when you depended on someone else for a paycheck, when your ability to pay rent rested on keeping a person like Richard satisfied. She hated the way it made her feel, trapped, powerless, as though her worth was tied to his approval. Yet she never let that bitterness show. Her mindset was one of survival, and she believed that dignity could still be found in doing what had to be done, even if no one else recognized it. As Richard barked his order, Mary felt her stomach twist. The crowd was beginning to press in, their eyes sharp, their whispers growing. She could feel their judgment, not directed at Richard but at her, as though they were silently wondering why she didn't fight back. She wanted to scream, to tell them that it wasn't cowardice keeping her still, but the reality of decisions no one else would face for her. If she lost this job, her son's after-school program would go unpaid, her mother's medication would fall behind, and the fragile balance she had built for her family would collapse like glass under pressure. "Please, not here," she murmured, her voice trembling but still carrying a note of dignity. It wasn't just a plea to Richard, it was a plea to the universe, to fate, to anyone who could spare her from this humiliation. Richard ignored her, of course. His ego drowned out her humanity, but Mary's words reached the ears of others. A woman in the crowd pressed her hand to her chest, visibly moved. A man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, as though reminded of his own employees waiting for his approval back at the office. Even strangers could feel the impact of her silence, the weight of her quiet struggle reverberating louder than any shout could have. Inside Mary's chest, her heart pounded with a mix of fear and resistance. She wanted to look Richard in the eye, to tell him, "You don't own me. You never will." But the fear of losing everything kept her still. Her dignity was intact, but it was buried under the crushing necessity of survival. She thought of her daughter Emily, who had been working on a school essay about resilience. Emily had asked her one night, "Mom, how do you stay strong when life isn't fair?" Mary hadn't known how to answer. But now, standing on that street corner, she realized that this was her answer. She stayed strong by enduring, even when her pride was being stripped away in public view. The humiliation burned. She felt as though every eye on her was stripping another layer of her worth, leaving her exposed. Yet even in her vulnerability, there was dignity in the way she held herself. She did not kneel, not yet. She kept her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though holding onto some invisible thread of strength that only she could feel. The crowd's energy was shifting. Some people looked at her with pity, others with admiration for her restraint. And in that silence, John's eyes locked on hers. It wasn't just that he saw her, it was that he recognized her struggle. He saw, beyond the uniform, beyond the trembling hands, into the heart of a woman who had given everything and received nothing but cruelty in return. "I can't just stand here," John whispered to himself, his decision already forming like a spark catching fire. Mary caught the faint sound of his words, and for the first time since Richard had started shouting, her shoulders eased just slightly. She didn't know what this stranger would do, but she knew that someone else had finally seen her, not just as a maid, not just as Richard's employee, but as a human being. That recognition alone was enough to spark something inside her, a small revelation that even in her silence, her struggle had impact. Richard, of course, was blind to it all. His focus remained on her compliance, on the performance of power. He mistook her silence for surrender, never realizing that it was a shield, a fragile but unbroken wall against the complete destruction of her dignity. He had no idea that the moment was already transforming, that the stage he thought he controlled was quietly slipping from his hands. Mary's story wasn't one of dramatic rebellion. It was one of quiet endurance, the kind of journey that reveals more strength than most people ever understand. And as the tension thickened, her silence became louder than Richard's commands. The crowd could feel it. John could feel it. And in that fragile balance between humiliation and dignity, the next moment was destined to tip the scales in ways no one he could have predicted. Richard's voice rose above the restless traffic like a siren, slicing through the murmurs and the neon buzz. "On your knees, Mary," he said, each word measured, the cadence almost theatrical. "You need to learn your place." He wasn't whispering. He wanted the city to hear him. He wanted the skyscrapers to look down and nod in agreement. The demand wasn't about correction, it was about domination, a spectacle engineered to stamp his authority into the concrete. The phrasing carried a cold promise. This was a lesson, and he intended to carve it into her memory. She didn't move. The stillness in her body was not consent, but survival, a balancing act between pride and the terrifying math of consequences. The crowd felt it before they understood it, the gravity of a moment that asked for decisions. Look away, get involved, or record. A teenager held up his phone, thumb hovering over the red dot. A delivery driver sipped his coffee, frozen in half-step between obligation and discomfort. A tourist couple exchanged glances, as if silently debating whether this scene belonged to them. The mixed reactions braided together into a tense silence that hummed with judgment and fear, the kind of silence a bully mistakes for approval. Mary's breath came shallow, her fingers tightening around themselves until the knuckles whitened. "Mr. Richard, please," she managed, the words thin but steady, as if she were erecting a fragile barrier made of syllables. Her plea was not performative. It was a final attempt to hold the line of her dignity without setting fire to the bridge that fed her family. She could feel the pressure of every eye, the way strangers' gazes can turn a private humiliation into a public trial. She sensed the hidden truth in the air, that people wanted this to end, but not all of them wanted to be the one to end it. Richard took a single step closer, enough to draw a soft ripple of sound from the onlookers. "You think I'm joking?" His smile was quick and thin, a blade more than an expression. "Kneel. It's simple." He tilted his head, as if speaking to a child. "Actions have consequences, Mary. Decisions teach lessons. This is yours." It was the kind of corporate language he used in meetings, repackaged cruelty presented as leadership. Behind the scenes, he thrived on compliance. Here in the open, he wanted confirmation that the world still bowed when he spoke. A woman in a blazer flinched and looked at her shoes, torn between outrage. "And the etiquette of not making a scene. This isn't right," she whispered to no one, to everyone. A man near the curb folded his arms, stern but immobile, the bystander's armor, concern without risk. A college kid muttered, "Somebody should do something," then glanced over his shoulder for a somebody that wasn't him. The crowd was filling the sidewalk with a surveillance-style quiet, that hush of modern onlookers who believe that filming equals involvement. Screens brightened, lenses tilted. Accountability felt outsourced to the algorithm. Richard raised his hands just enough to frame the stage. "You all see, this is what happens when respect disappears." The irony went unnoticed by him. It landed like a slap on everyone else. He gestured at the ground in front of Mary, a small rectangle of pavement suddenly converted into a commandment. "Kneel, right here." Mary's throat tightened. She could hear her mother's voice, practical, warm, relentless. "Hold your head high, even when your back must bend to survive." She thought of Emily's crayon drawings magneted onto the fridge and her son's science project drying on the table. She wasn't choosing between pride and obedience. She was choosing between food and eviction notices, between insulin refills and unpaid balances. Her mindset had been forged in 1,000 small emergencies, the daily triage of a working mother who could not afford to shatter. She did not bow, but the temptation to end the ordeal in one motion pressed against her bones. "I said now," Richard snapped, the word cracking like a gavel. He looked from face to face, searching for a mirror that would reflect his certainty back to him. "Do you want me to count?" He didn't need a number. The threat was the point. A few people gasped, and someone hissed out a quiet, "Man, that's messed up." But the space between conscience and action stayed heavy and untraveled. John's voice arrived like a steady hand on a shoulder. "You don't have to do that." He didn't shout. He placed the sentence in the air with care, as if not to startle it. The line drew a dozen heads in his direction. Mary looked up, a small tremor passing through her features, the tremor of being seen. John's eyes were unwavering. "No lesson gets taught by breaking someone," he said, and the tension shifted, the crowd subtly rearranging around a new center of gravity. Richard pivoted. "You talking to me?" The question wasn't a question. It was a door slammed across a hallway. "I'm talking to whoever thinks humiliation equals leadership," John replied. "If that's you, then yes." He planted his feet like someone who knew storms and stayed anyway. A simple jacket, a worn backpack, the unremarkable look of a man who had learned his own value without needing a stage. The air drew tight. A biker in a reflective vest muttered, "Careful, man," as if the script of power were an engine that could chew up anyone who stepped too close. A young woman lowered her phone just enough to watch without glass between her and the moment. The city's soundtrack, horns, crosswalk beeps, a bus sighing at the curb, seemed to fade beneath the faint charge of a revelation forming. People were measuring themselves, reconsidering their decisions, testing the edges of their own courage. Richard's smile returned, thinner now. "This is between my employee and me," he said, each syllable varnished in legalese. "She signed a contract. She answers to me." Mary found her voice, a thread drawn through a needle. "I answer to my work," she said softly, "not to shame." The sentence surprised even her, and it traveled through the crowd as a spark, visible only when it caught. Richard's gaze hardened. "One more time, Mary, kneel." He pivoted to the onlookers, inviting them into the logic of his theater. When people don't learn, they repeat mistakes. "We're talking accountability." He loved that word. It sounded clean. It disinfected cruelty. He was counting on the audience to accept it as truth. John took half a step forward, a quiet decision that carried more impact than a shout. Accountability for what? A spilled coffee, a late shirt? Or is the hidden truth that you can't control anything else today, so you're trying to control her? The sentence broke something open. A few heads nodded. A barista in an apron whispered, "Yes," under her breath, and the delivery driver set his coffee on the hood of his van as if to free both hands, just in case the moment asked for them. Richard's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself." He turned back to Mary, impatient with the detour. "Kneel." His fingers tapped his watch, a choreography of status. "We're done pretending you have a choice." But something had altered. The crowd's stillness wasn't passive anymore. It had the density of an audience choosing a side. A man in a navy suit took a step nearer and cleared his throat, as if considering a sentence he wasn't used to speaking aloud. An elderly woman leaned on her cane and shook. Her head, not in outrage but in weary knowledge, the kind that comes from a long journey of watching people misuse whatever power they had. The city was revealing itself, its compassion, its fear, its contradictions, like a behind-the-scenes cut of everyday life, the parts normally hidden by speed and routine. Mary's knees trembled. For a terrifying second, she felt them start to bend, not because she agreed, not because she surrendered, but because the body sometimes tries to end pain any way it can. She steadied herself, lifted her chin by a fraction. "Please," she said again, but the word wore a new shape now, less plea and more boundary. John saw it, the micro-movement, the brink, and spoke quickly, not to Richard, but to Mary. "You don't owe him your dignity." The line met her eyes and stayed there. She breathed in, found a thin ribbon of strength, and wrapped her fingers around it. A teenage girl near the front edged closer, voice barely above the street's heartbeat. "Ma'am, do you want me to call someone?" The question was awkward but brave, a small bridge built between strangers. Mary didn't answer. She couldn't, not without risking collapse. But she met the girl's eyes, and gratitude flickered, a revelation passing wordlessly in the space between them. Richard clapped once, crisp. "Enough! On your knees!" His certainty was steel, but the echo wasn't as sharp now. The command boomeranged into a crowd that had started to think for itself. The mindset he depended on, the reflex that made people obey the loudest person, was loosening. A man from the back spoke, tentative yet audible. "Hey, cut it out," he said, as if testing how it felt to stand near the line. Someone else followed. "This isn't a lesson. It's abuse." The words weren't coordinated. They didn't need to be. They were decisions, discrete and individual, accumulating mass. John's tone remained even. "If you truly want a lesson, teach it with respect. Apologize. Learn the reason behind the mistake. This," he gestured to the pavement, "this has nothing to do with improvement. It's theater." Richard scoffed. "You don't know how I run my life." "I don't need to," John said. "It's written all over how you're running this moment." For the first time, a flush rose along Richard's neck, a signal flare of something he never advertised. Doubt. He glanced at the phones, at the faces, at the ecosystem of witnesses he had summoned without understanding what witnesses do. He needed the crowd's silence. To stay powerful, he was discovering that silence can vote without clapping. His eyes cut back to Mary, as if her compliance could still rewind the tape. Mary felt the street under her soles. Solid, imperfect, real. She pictured her mother counting out pills at the kitchen table, her son balancing equations on loose-leaf paper, Emily's silver pin glinting faintly in her hair. She breathed, slowly, as if drawing air through a narrow straw, but making it count. "I'm doing my job," she said. The words modest and unremarkable, the kind of line that passes unnoticed in calmer scenes. Here, it landed like a stake. "I won't do this." A murmur, a couple of claps, quickly smothered by their owners, surprised at themselves. The delivery driver said, "That's right." Not loudly, but with that particular conviction of a person who's worked for tips and knows what it costs to speak. The teenager lowered his phone completely and looked at Richard with that clear-eyed expression young people have when they decide a thing is wrong without needing a spreadsheet. Richard's mouth opened and closed, a glitch in a script that had never included pushback. "You won't?" He tried to laugh, but the sound thinned out. "You won't?" He searched for the old levers. Threats, money, humiliation, but the controls were sticking. The crowd had become a mirror, reflecting not his legend, but his choices. John didn't advance. He didn't need to. "You can stop this," he said, almost gentle. "Right now. That's a decision, too." A bus exhaled at the curb. The walk sign ticked down. For a heartbeat, the city held a fragile equilibrium that trembled before a transformation when everyone senses the next frame is important and no one knows what it contains. Richard stared at Mary as if trying to force the world back into a familiar shape by will alone. Mary kept her ground, every muscle pleading for release, while her spine told a different story. The crowd leaned inward, not as voyeurs, but as participants in a revelation that dignity sometimes looks like standing completely still when someone tries to push you to the floor. And from somewhere along the curb, a new voice rose, patient, steady, the kind that belongs to people who choose words the way careful hands choose tools. It cut through in a way that promised the scene was about to shift, not towards spectacle, but towards something with real impact, the kind of turn that exposes what was always true underneath the noise and invites everyone present to decide who they are when a line appears on the pavement. He wasn't the type of man you'd notice first on a busy Chicago sidewalk. John wore a navy windbreaker that had seen too many autumns, jeans softened by years of errands and early trains, and a pair of sneakers that squeaked faintly when he stopped short. He had the posture of someone who carried weight without advertising it, shoulders squared, chin modest, eyes attentive. To most strangers, he was just another commuter finishing a long day. But if you looked closer, you would see the steadiness, the quiet calibration of a person who had learned how to breathe when the air thinned. Some days, he was Mr. Howard to 32 eighth graders on the South Side, a social studies teacher who could turn a dull civics paragraph into a living map of decisions and consequences. Other days, he still felt like Sergeant Howard from a life he rarely mentioned, a veteran who had done a tour overseas and brought back a promise to himself. When you see a line you know is wrong, you step over it. He kept that promise the way other people kept punch cards for coffee. He didn't come into this story looking for confrontation. He had 2 paperbacks in his backpack, one for his students, one for his daughter, Lucy, who had asked him to read the first chapter with her tonight. He was thinking about dinner and the phone call he owed his brother in Ohio. But the moment he rounded the corner and saw Mary frozen against the tide of strangers, saw Richard's hand cutting the air like a baton, something ancient and immediate ignited in him. It wasn't anger first, it was recognition. He had seen this before, not in the details but in the structure. A person with leverage turning it into a lever, a public stage arranged to make someone small. His steps slowed as the words reached him: kneel, lesson, respect, the language of discipline repurposed as theater. There is a hidden truth about people like John. Their courage doesn't arrive in drumbeats. It arrives in a simple alignment of values and timing, a quiet click inside the chest. He felt that click now, like a compass needle finding north. The city blurred for a second, the exhaust, the ads, the impatient beeping, and the scene came into focus as if framed by 2 invisible hands. Mary's fingers were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Richard's jaw worked like a metronome. The crowd dilated and contracted with uncertainty, a living lung too afraid to exhale. John knew what the algorithm of the moment looked like. If no one interrupts the pattern wins. He moved without rushing. People in front of him parted the way honey parts around a spoon. He didn't raise his voice, didn't puff his chest. He just arrived at the edge of the circle where fear and curiosity keep their uneasy truce. His students would have recognized the look on his face, the one he wore before a hard conversation that he refused to avoid. "You don't have to do that," he said. To Mary, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a person acknowledging another person. The line landed between them like a flat stone on water, calm, deliberate, making ripples. "Keep walking," Richard snapped, as if dismissing a waiter who'd brought the wrong bottle. "This is private business." He tossed the words into the air as a gate, expecting them to clang shut. John blinked once, slow. "Private business ended when you turned the sidewalk into a stage," he replied. "What you're doing isn't a lesson. It's humiliation dressed up with a word you like. He didn't spit the sentence. He stacked it carefully, like a teacher placing blocks for a child to see their shape. He wasn't trying to perform. In fact, he hated performing. He was trying to alter the trajectory, the same way he did when two of his students pushed desks together with too much force and the room's oxygen changed. His mindset wasn't adversarial, it was corrective. He believed in transformation through truth, not spectacle. And the truth was standing right in front of him. A man who thought he could sculpt respect out of fear. A woman who was holding her posture together with sheer willpower. And a crowd of witnesses deciding what version of themselves they would be at 5:42 on a random weekday. Mary's eyes found him like a lifeline snagged on a rock. She didn't ask for rescue. She rarely asked for anything, but her expression said what her voice couldn't. Thank you for naming what this is. From her side of the experience, the behind-the-scenes calculation never stopped. Rent, meds, groceries, bus passes, the school fundraiser her daughter had mentioned at breakfast. She stood within inches of submission and inches of refusal, the two poles of a magnet trembling to choose. The presence of a steady voice, "You don't have to do that," shifted the field. John had learned long ago that decisions travel. A choice made by one person changes the choices available to others. So when he added another sentence, "No one here has to pretend this is okay," he was widening the walkway for the timid feet behind him. The crowd inhaled as a single organism. A tourist with a camera lowered it. A nurse in scrubs took one step forward and planted herself a small stake. A college kid in a hoodie slid his phone into his pocket, shame sprinkling across his face like rain when he realized he'd been filming instead of thinking. Richard looked at John as if trying to identify the model. He saw no brand, no badge, no company logo to sue. It annoyed him. Power, to him, worked through labels and contracts, elevators and reservations. This man had none of those markers. "You have no idea who I am," Richard said, his mouth tightening. "You're making a mistake." "I know exactly who you are in this moment," John said evenly, "and I'm making a choice." There was no threat in his tone, no heat, just the clean edge of a line drawn with a ruler. People think courage is a surge, but for John, it was a sequence. His training had taught him to scan a room, exits, obstacles, allies. His teaching had taught him how to phrase a sentence that could lower a temperature without lowering the standard. "Sir," he added, "back away from her." It was the gentlest version of a command he knew. The words carried the authority of someone who understood escalation and wanted no part of it. Mary exhaled. It was a tiny sound, but the nurse heard it and angled slightly toward her, an anchor offered without touch. "Do you want water?" the nurse asked softly, not to solve the universe, but to mark one human gesture on a ledger that had suddenly become public. "I'm okay," Mary whispered, though her voice buckled on okay. Richard bristled. "Back away. She works for me." He gestured at the invisible contract hovering between them, as if the legal relationship included the right to rewrite the laws of dignity. "I'm teaching accountability." He was a man welded to his vocabulary, unwilling to admit that. The same word can mean two different things depending on where you aim it. John nodded once, as if authenticating the claim, and then returning it for correction. Accountability is when we own our errors, not when we force someone to perform shame for an audience. He let the sentence sit. He knew from the classroom that silence could be a scalpel if you gave it room. The crowd adjusted around the idea, some wincing, some agreeing, some itching to argue but lacking the language. And here was the revelation he expected but never enjoyed. Richard wasn't used to being named. People who cared about his favor swallowed their objections until they tasted like paperwork. He saw the world as a set of escalators that moved when he arrived. Now the stairs were still. He felt the unfamiliar exertion of having to climb. His breath shortened, a detail he masked with a scoff. "You're done," he said to Mary, pointing. "Pack your things. You're finished." The punishment pivoted. A decision switched. From humiliation to termination when the first act failed to conclude on command. The words hit like a shove. Mary's knees wavered again, not from the demand to kneel, but from the threat to her family's fragile math. John saw it, the way a body registers loss faster than the mind can phrase it. "No," he said, but this time to the air, to the outcome, to the accelerating slope. "We're not going there." He angled his shoulders, widening his presence the way you widen a doorway for a stretcher. "Sir, stop." "I won't," Richard said, and the promise curled like smoke. He turned to the watching faces, attempting to recruit them with the language of efficiency and order. "She's incompetent. She's irresponsible. This is what happens when standards slip." He looked for nods and received a dozen blank stares that felt to him like betrayal. John resisted the urge to rebut the resume of insults. He knew from experience that debating a man like this on his preferred terrain, labels, status, keywords, was a trap, so he chose the terrain that mattered. "Mary," he said, "look at me." She did, slowly, as if moving through syrup. "You're not going to kneel," he told her, and his voice, while quiet, wore a certainty that borrowed strength from 1,000 mornings he had spent telling shy kids they could present their projects. "You're going to stand exactly as you are while I say what needs saying." He turned back to Richard and let the veteran in him tick off the facts, like checkpoints. "You've issued a public command that violates basic respect. You've attempted to coerce compliance through fear. You've escalated to firing in public, which is not only cruel but reckless. You are not in control of yourself. And if you're not in control of yourself, you don't get to control other people." He let the last clause settle into the crowd's ribs. Words can tilt a city block if they're placed correctly. The delivery driver finally spoke up, voice gravelly with late shifts. "He's..." "Right," he said to the air, then to Richard. "Man, you're out of line." The college kid added, "This is messed." The tourist couple nodded in sync. The nurse straightened as if approving a chart. These were small endorsements, but together they produced impact, like pebbles hitting a windshield until the crack spidered. Richard's mouth bent into a shape that meant threat. "You don't want trouble," he told John. "I've had trouble," John answered, not bragging, just testifying. "It didn't teach me to make other people small," he added, almost as an aside. "It taught me to make decisions I can live with at night." That part wasn't for Richard. It was for anyone listening who would later replay the scene at their sink, deciding who they were when the air gets tight. Mary felt a slow warmth in her hands as circulation resumed. She realized she'd been digging her nails into her palms and loosened them. "I didn't spill the coffee," she said quietly. "Not to win, not even to defend, but to place." Her truth on the table. "It was the wind when I opened the car." Her voice carried the ordinary detail that cruelty never bothers to learn. The nurse nodded. "Happens every day," she murmured, making the ordinary noble by refusing to dismiss it. John lifted his chin a fraction. "That's an explanation," he said, "not an excuse. Adults use explanations to fix systems, not people to break them." Something shifted a few feet away, where an older man in a Cubs cap had been watching with the patient. Disapproval of someone who has already seen this movie. He stepped forward just enough to be counted. "Son," he told Richard, not unkindly, "you're digging." The single phrase had the gravity of community wisdom. Richard's eyes flicked from face to face, as if the crowd were a malfunctioning device he could reboot with impatience. The performance had turned on him, and he didn't know his lines anymore. He had spent years believing respect was a product he could invoice. Now he stood inside a revelation that respect is leased from your choices, renewed every time you open your mouth. The behind-the-scenes mechanism of his life, assistants absorbing blame, colleagues overlooking temper for profit, friends confusing volume with strength, was exposed in daylight. He hated the exposure. He wasn't practiced at reflection, he was practiced at reaction. So he reached for the only lever he trusted. "Security!" he called toward the store behind him, even though no security had been summoned and no one was coming. The call rang false. The crowd heard it and filed the detail under panic disguised as protocol. John didn't chase the deflection. He held the center like someone who had practiced holding it in rooms that mattered. "You can walk away," he said, each word deliberate. That's the smartest choice left. Make it. He wasn't gloating. He was granting an exit. It's a kind of mercy to hand a man a door when he's built himself into a corner. Mary's breathing steadied. She set her shoulders, not to fight, but to exist without apology. I'm going home after I finish my shift, she said almost to herself, a vow disguised as logistics. The nurse smiled with the corners of her eyes. The college kid nodded, as if he'd learned a new definition of strength in under 5 minutes. The delivery driver picked up his coffee and didn't drink it, holding it like a prop that had lost its purpose. And then, from the edge where the scene met the flow of the city, a new voice entered, measured, unmistakably official without being loud, the kind of voice that belongs to people who are trained to de-escalate rather than inflame. It threaded through the gathered bodies and drew them into a slightly wider circle, the way careful hands loosen a knot before they untie it. The presence that followed carried not performance but process, not domination but structure, and with it came the next turn of this moment's journey, the one that would test not just pride and shame, but the truth of what accountability actually means when the microphone is in the street and every decision leaves a mark. John didn't raise his voice, but the tone he used carried a weight that turned heads. There's a particular kind of silence that follows, when truth enters a space where lies and arrogance have been echoing too long. That's the silence that swept across the corner now as John stepped forward. He wasn't rushing, wasn't threatening. He was deliberate, as if every inch forward was a decision weighed and chosen. His eyes locked on Richard, not with anger, but with a steadiness that made the millionaire shift his weight without meaning to. "You don't get to do this," John said, his words precise, like nails hammered straight into wood. "Your money doesn't buy you that right. It doesn't buy you her dignity, and it doesn't buy this crowd's silence." Richard blinked, startled at the audacity. "Excuse me? Who are you to tell me how to handle my employee?" His voice cracked. Slightly, not enough for him to notice, but enough for the crowd to register. John tilted his head, the faintest trace of compassion weaving through his firmness. "Who am I? I'm just a man who won't walk past cruelty and pretend it isn't happening. I'm not here for a fight. I'm here because respect isn't something you purchase, it's something you live." The crowd reacted with a low murmur. Some nodded almost instinctively, as if a long-buried thought had just been spoken aloud. A young man near the front muttered, "Yeah, that's right," his voice catching the rhythm of agreement. For the first time, Richard realized the audience wasn't with him anymore. They were with this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Richard's smirk faltered. He tried to recover, straightening his suit jacket, as if appearance could patch the hole in his control. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "She's under my authority. She works for me. That means she does what I say." John's eyes flicked to Mary, then back to Richard. His reply came out calm, but edged with a firmness that left no space for doubt. "Authority is not a license for cruelty. Leadership is not the same as control. And if you think you can treat people like they're disposable props in your life, then maybe it's time someone held a mirror up to you." Mary stood frozen, torn between terror and awe. For years, she had been forced to carry the weight of his words alone, swallowing the humiliation in silence. Now, for the first time, someone had broken through that barrier, voicing the hidden truth she had never dared to say. Richard laughed, but it was brittle, thin as glass. "You don't understand how the world works, do you? People like her need discipline. People like me keep things running. That's why I'm successful and she cleans floors." It was the wrong thing to say, the wrong time, the wrong audience, the wrong arrogance. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and a woman's voice rang out sharply. "You can't talk to her like that!" The crowd tightened, shifting closer, no longer passive witnesses but something else, something alive, brimming with the potential to tip the balance. John took another step forward, the space between him and Richard shrinking to only a few feet. His posture remained calm, but his words cut like chisels carving away pretense. "No, what makes you successful is luck and leverage. Don't mistake privilege for superiority, and don't mistake her silence for weakness. She's stronger than you'll ever be because she's endured more in 1 week than you have in a lifetime of comfort. Mary's lips trembled. She wanted to deny it, to minimize it, but the truth in his words forced a lump into her throat. She thought of every early morning, every aching back, every night lying awake wondering if she'd made enough to cover bills. She wasn't weak. She was surviving. And for once, someone saw it. Richard's voice climbed higher, trying to regain control. I said, back off. You don't know me. You don't know my life. You're right, John answered. I don't know the behind-the-scenes details of your life, but I don't need to, because who you are is revealed in how you treat people when you think no one is watching. That's the real you. And right now, in front of all these witnesses, your truth is showing. The revelation hung in the air, undeniable, sharp, and painful. Richard's face flushed, and for the first time his eyes darted nervously toward the phones pointed at him. Every angle of his cruelty was being recorded, archived, made permanent. His wealth could shield him from many things, but not from the truth of a video that would outlive his excuses. Mary whispered, almost involuntarily, "Thank you." Her voice was so faint it could have vanished into the city noise, but John heard it. He didn't respond with words, just gave her the smallest nod, a signal that said, "You don't owe me anything. You just deserve better." The crowd shifted again, some stepping forward, the circle closing around Richard. The dynamic had transformed. He was no longer the man in control, but the man on trial. The eyes that once looked at him with indifference now burned with judgment. Strangers who had been frozen in indecision moments ago were now aligning themselves silently behind John's courage. Richard tried one last time to weaponize his voice. "You'll regret this," he threatened, his finger jabbing in the air. "I'll make sure of it." But his words no longer landed. They fell flat against the current that had shifted away from him. The crowd's silence was no longer consent, it was condemnation. And in that silence, John took one more step forward, his presence undeniable. "You've already lost," he said softly. "Not your money, not your job, but something far greater. You lost your dignity the moment you tried to steal hers. And now, everyone sees it." The words were simple, but their impact was seismic. They cracked the illusion Richard had built, exposing the emptiness beneath his arrogance. Mary's shoulders lifted slightly, as though a weight had shifted off her chest. The crowd exhaled, the air alive with a sense of transformation. And just as the tension reached its peak, another figure emerged from the edge of the crowd, drawn in by the spectacle and the unfolding drama. The stranger's steady voice cut into the charged silence, adding a new dimension to the moment. And what followed would push this confrontation into an entirely new territory, one that none of them could have predicted. The energy of the street shifted in a way Richard could feel in his chest. Moments earlier, he had stood like a conductor orchestrating silence, expecting obedience to flow through fear. Now the silence was different. It was dense, charged, filled with the hum of people who were no longer watching a scene, but witnessing a revelation. It was the kind of silence that made a man realize his power had already slipped through his fingers. And the very crowd he believed he commanded had begun to turn against him. Phones glowed brighter now, lifted higher. Every angle of his face, every word he spoke, every sneer and demand was being captured, multiplied into 1,000 possible replays. Some recordings streamed live, their comment sections swelling with outrage in real time. Richard had always enjoyed cameras when they were positioned in his boardrooms, at galas, in carefully curated press releases. But these cameras told a different story, one he couldn't control, one that revealed the hidden truth behind his polished image. John stood firmly, not aggressive, not dramatic, but with a presence that absorbed the weight of the crowd's attention. He hadn't planned to become the center of anything, yet there he was, framed by the neon reflections and the restless shuffling of bystanders who were aligning themselves with him without saying a word. It wasn't charisma or performance that drew them. It was clarity. He was the one. Voice, naming the cruelty everyone else felt but hadn't spoken. Mary, still trembling, noticed it too. She felt the pressure on her shoulders shift slightly, as though dozens of strangers had stepped in to share the weight she'd been carrying alone. She had lived most of her journey in invisibility, cleaning hallways while people passed without seeing her, serving coffee that went unnoticed unless it was late. But now, the city saw her. They didn't see a uniform. They saw a woman whose dignity had been threatened, and in that recognition she felt her spine hold steady. Richard's jaw flexed as he scanned the crowd, searching for support, for someone to nod or agree, for one ally to anchor his authority. But he found only narrowed eyes, furrowed brows, lips pressed tight. Even the ones who had remained passive were now shifting closer to John's side, pulled by the gravity of a truth they couldn't unsee. The impact was immediate and suffocating. He was outnumbered not by fists, but by perception. His wealth, which usually served as his armor, was useless here. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" Richard snapped, his finger aimed at John like a weapon. "You don't know me. You don't know what it takes to build an empire. You don't know the sacrifices." John didn't flinch. His reply was calm, almost quiet, but it cut deeper for its restraint. "I don't need to know your empire. I know what it takes to be human, and that costs nothing." The crowd murmured again, louder. This time, their voices layering into a collective response. A teenager shouted, "He's right," while someone else added, "This is wrong, man." The shift was undeniable. Strangers were now giving voice to what had been whispers. The silence that once protected Richard had fractured into open defiance. Mary's eyes filled, not with tears of weakness, but with the emotion of witnessing something she had never imagined. Strangers rallying for her, standing against the man who had always loomed like a shadow over her livelihood. She whispered under her breath, "I never thought anyone would," but the words trailed off, carried away by the wind and the weight of the moment. Richard's smirk faltered into something rawer, a glimpse behind the scenes of his polished mask. Fear. Not fear of John's words, not even fear of losing face in front of strangers, but fear of exposure. Fear that the image he had cultivated for decades could collapse in minutes under the lens of 100 phones. His empire was built on reputation, and reputation was built on control. Now control was gone. He tried again, desperation leaking into his tone. "You don't understand. She works for me. She owes me respect." John's eyes didn't waver. "Respect isn't owed. It's earned, and you've lost it tonight." His words weren't theatrical, but they reverberated with impact, bouncing off the glass storefronts and into the hearts of everyone listening. The crowd tightened around him, some stepping forward instinctively, others lifting their phones higher. It wasn't violence, it was alignment. It was dozens of ordinary people making the decision, in real time, to stand with truth instead of fear. Their body language said everything. Richard wasn't the center anymore. John was. Mary was. The human dignity he tried to erase had become the very spotlight he couldn't dim. Richard's hand trembled as he pointed again, but the gesture looked smaller now, weaker. His words stumbled. "You'll all regret this. Do you know who I am?" This time the question didn't land. A young woman near the front answered, her voice steady, "We see who you are," and the crowd murmured in agreement. That simple revelation, "we see you," was enough to tip the balance further. His wealth no longer mattered. His name no longer intimidated. His truth had been revealed, and it was ugly. Mary took a breath, long and deliberate, the kind of breath that felt like transformation. For years she had trained herself to shrink in his presence, to keep her eyes lowered, to keep her voice soft. But now, standing in the protection of strangers who had chosen to align with her, she lifted her chin. She didn't speak yet, but her silence had changed. It wasn't submission, it was defiance. John saw it and gave her the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement that her dignity was intact. Then he turned back to Richard, stepping closer still. his voice unwavering. "You wanted a lesson tonight," he said. "Here it is. Wealth can buy cars, suits, and influence, but it cannot buy respect. And when you try to strip someone of their dignity, you lose your own." The words echoed in the gathering air, and for the first time, Richard had no response. His throat worked, but no words came out. His power, once unquestioned, had collapsed under the collective weight of truth. He looked around, desperate for an escape, but every corner of the street seemed to hold a lens, a judgment, a witness. The crowd was no longer passive, it was active, alive, leaning toward John and Mary away from him. And in that fragile, charged moment, a new figure pressed forward from the back, a presence that carried authority not from arrogance, but from something steadier. The city's noise seemed to hush for their arrival, as though the story was ready to pivot again, pulling everyone deeper into the unfolding revelation. For a man who curated every angle of his life, humiliation arrived not as a single blow, but as a sequence of tiny, undeniable revelations. Richard felt them first in the way the crowd's gaze hardened, then in the way his own voice sounded thin to his ears, then in the unmistakable truth that the phones weren't blinking, they were recording. The polished avatar he had spent years building, the one that lived in glossy magazines and on donation plaques, met the raw, unedited version of himself that had surfaced on this sidewalk. The collision rattled him. What had started as a performance of dominance was now a public inventory of his character. He looked around for a softer lens and found none. Every face reflected the same verdict: you crossed a line. The authority that moved through the circle didn't flash a badge or shout orders. It was a woman in a city jacket with a calm steadiness about her. Part transit supervisor, part neighborhood guardian, someone who knew how to read a crowd and how to take heat out of a boiling scene. "Folks, let's give each other space," she said, not scolding, not pleading, simply organizing the air. People adjusted a foot here, an inch there, but no one broke the circle of witness. When she looked at Mary, her tone changed by a degree, softer, but not pitying. "Ma'am, are you safe?" Mary nodded, a measured motion, and the woman's hand hovered in that respectful distance that says, "I'm here if you need me." John remained beside Mary like a windbreak, absorbing the gusts. He didn't posture, didn't announce victory, didn't glare. He kept his focus where it mattered, on the person who had been targeted. "You're okay," he said under his breath, a sentence more like a bridge than a declaration. The nurse offered a small bottle of water. The teenager ratcheted his camera down to his chest. The delivery driver positioned himself so a careless elbow wouldn't jostle Mary. None of these gestures were dramatic, that was the point. Dignity often returns in ordinary pieces. Richard tried to recover the narrative. He turned to the supervisor as if she were a receptionist in his building. "This has gone too far," he said, angling his body so the cameras would catch his most executive profile. "She's insubordinate. He," a jab toward John, "is interfering. I have the right." "You had a choice," John answered, not loud, but with a clarity that clipped each word clean. "You still do." He let the line hang. It transformed the moment from spectacle into decision-making, and decisions are where character is built. The supervisor's eyes flicked between them, assessing risk, reading subtext, mapping outcomes like a chessboard. She'd seen versions of this before, status inflamed into cruelty, crowds deciding whether to be mirrors or megaphones, and she understood the calculus. If the man with power couldn't locate his brakes, the community had to become one. Richard inhaled to speak and caught a glimpse of himself reflected in a phone screen. Jaw tight, finger raised, eyes glittering with the kind of heat that leaves scorch marks. For half a heartbeat, the image jolted him. "Is that me?" The question flashed and vanished, swallowed by habit. He reached for the lever he trusted most: threat. "Everyone recording right now is violating privacy," he announced, attempting to weaponize etiquette. "Delete it." No one moved. The word delete floated uselessly and then dissolved. because this wasn't a boardroom where he could collect devices at the door or insist on NDAs. This was a sidewalk where behavior is the only policy that counts. The crowd's stillness was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was the ethical consensus of strangers. Documentation keeps the powerful honest. If there was a hidden truth on this corner, it was that public opinion is not for sale. It is rented by your choices, minute to minute. Mary's throat worked, her voice a careful thread. I just want to finish my day with some respect. The sentence was small and enormous at the same time, the kind of line that doesn't belong to headlines but outlives them. You could feel the impact ripple. The college kid who had earlier tucked his phone away now raised it again, not to sensationalize but to seal an understanding. This is what the story is really about. Richard attempted a pivot to pity, a late play in a shaken mindset. You don't know how much stress I'm under, he said, and he was telling a version of the truth, but the confession was misdirected. Stress didn't make him cruel. It revealed where he'd allowed cruelty to grow unchallenged. I donate 6 figures to, he started, and this time the nurse's voice interrupted with a gentle precision that felt like a needle sliding into the exact vein. Kindness is not a tax write-off, she said. It's how you treat the person in front of you. The line landed softly and firmly. Richard's shoulders dropped a fraction, a tell only the closest observers would catch. In the behind-the-scenes reel of his thoughts, the audio grew cluttered. This isn't how this goes. This isn't how people talk to me. He fumbled for his phone, not to call anyone, just to touch it like a talisman. The gesture betrayed him. Even through glass, the cameras read panic. John didn't follow up with triumph. He offered a route out. You can back away, Richard, he said, using the name with intention, not as a jab, but as a tether to personhood. You can apologize. You can decide that this moment won't be the snapshot of who you are. He took a slow breath. Or you can keep digging. A man in a Cubs cap, who had been silently measuring the angles of right and wrong, nodded as if a verdict had reached him through a private channel. Best deal on the table, he murmured to no one in particular. Take it. Mary's hands had stopped shaking. She stood an inch taller, not out of defiance, but because weight redistributed itself when other people carried a share. The silver pin in her hair caught a corner of sunlight, an accidental spotlight on an ordinary artifact that now felt like a talisman of survival. She didn't want retribution. She wanted closure without damage. I'm not trying to embarrass you, she said, and even Richard seemed surprised by her restraint. I'm trying to be treated like I exist. The words pulled a seam through the crowd's collective chest. Existence should be the floor, not the ceiling. That was the revelation the street agreed on without voting. You could see it in the way shoulders softened and jaws unclenched. Transformation sometimes arrives as a recalibrated baseline. Richard looked at Mary as if seeing the outline of a person where moments ago he'd only acknowledged a role. Something old and rusty shifted in him, a hinge that hadn't moved in years. He could have said, I'm sorry. He could have said, I was wrong. But a lifetime of excusing his reflection wouldn't yield easily. Pride is glue, it hardens fast, and cameras make it harder to admit you've broken something you shouldn't have touched. He opted for retreat packaged as logistics. We're done here, he announced, stepping back toward the sleek car that had for so long been both armor and emblem. He tried to turn his exit into control, keys flashing like a baton, but the theater wouldn't cooperate. Doors that once opened to him like stage curtains now felt heavy. Even the metal seemed to resist, as though the vehicle wanted no part of the scene that had unfolded beside it. The supervisor didn't block him. She didn't need to. Control had already left his hands. Sir, she said, voice even, leaving is a good choice. I recommend you make it with some grace. It was the gentlest form of instruction, offered like a clean towel after a spill. He bristled, then caught himself, then nodded once, a small, grudging concession to reality. John turned to Mary, orienting the moment where it belonged. Do you need anything before you go? The question was not rhetorical. It opened a lane for practical care. The nurse offered her name. "I'm Alana. I work at Northwestern." And the delivery driver asked if she wanted him to walk her to the corner. The teenager, all sincerity now, said, "I'll airdrop you the video if you want it." These were not grand gestures. They were stitches. Mary managed a thin smile that didn't pretend gladness but registered safety. "Thank you. I can walk." She took the bottle of water, not because she was thirsty, but because accepting help is sometimes the bravest movement a person can make after surviving a public trial. Her voice carried steady. "I'm going to finish my tasks, and then I'm going home." Richard paused with the car door half open, his profile cut against the city like a cautionary silhouette. You could almost see his calculations: PR damage, employment law, who to call first, how to spin the narrative. But equations can't fix character. He glanced back, searching for one sympathetic face to co-sign his version of events. No one offered it. The absence of validation was its own verdict. He slid into the seat, the leather no longer feeling like status, just material, and for a long breath he didn't start the engine. John looked from the car to the circle of people and did the simplest thing a person can do to restore order. He noticed them. "Thank you," he said. Not a speech, not a rallying cry, simply acknowledgement that community had done what it's for. The college kid lifted a hand. The Cubs cap man tipped his brim. Alana squeezed Mary's forearm and stepped back. Even the supervisor's posture changed, tension leaving her shoulders the way steam leaves a kettle. When the flame is turned down, the phone's lowered, not because the scene had ended, but because its center of gravity had shifted from spectacle to sense. Strangers returned to themselves a little altered, carrying a private note. The day had asked a question, and they had answered. That's how transformation works most of the time, not as fireworks, but as a quiet upgrade to your operating system. Inside the car, Richard stared at his own reflection in the darkened display. The glass gave him back a man mid-sentence, mid-lesson, mid-loss. His mind scrolled excuses, then landed on an image. Mary's hands, white-knuckled, and then not. He felt a twinge, guilt or embarrassment or both, and recoiled from it like from a hot surface. He'd learned to treat introspection as an inefficient use of time, yet here it was, unavoidable, a mirror he couldn't outsource. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction, sagging under their own weight. He gripped the wheel and released it, unable to decide whether to flee or face the residue he'd created. Mary stood with John a few steps from the curb. The noise of the city resumed its ordinary composition, buses sighing, crosswalks chirping, conversations folding back into themselves, but it all sounded different now, as if a filter had been lifted. She took a breath that felt like territory reclaimed. "I've got to pick up my mom's prescription after this," she said, which was how brave people talk. They anchor lofty moments to practical next steps. "I can walk you," John offered, tone simple, not possessive. She shook her head, appreciative. "I'll be okay." She glanced at the crowd and gave a nod that functioned as a communal receipt. "Thank you for seeing me." The nurse's eyes shone. The teenager whispered, "Any time," and laughed softly at himself for how earnest it sounded. The supervisor checked in one last time with the choreography of someone who closes circles for a living. "If either of you needs to make a report, I can direct you," she said, offering a card without pressure. Mary took it. The exchange was not a threat or a promise. It was infrastructure. Richard finally started the car. The engine's hum entered the scene like a reluctant admission. He gripped the wheel with a man's habitual certainty and found it didn't fit as well as it used to. Retreat can feel like surrender when you've mistaken dominance for direction. He could have rolled the window down. He could have said the sentence that ends conflict more cleanly than any exit. "I'm sorry." The option existed, hovered, waited. He chose the simpler motion, drive, and the vehicle pulled into traffic as if nothing had happened, though everyone who watched knew something had. What remained on the sidewalk wasn't triumphalism, but a kind of respectful quiet. People don't cheer dignity. They honor it by adjusting their own. The circle loosened. The teenager checked his battery and looked sheepish. The delivery driver finally drank the coffee that had cooled in his hand. The Cubs cap man ambled toward the crosswalk with the satisfied fatigue of someone who had helped set a crooked picture straight. Alana's last glance at Mary was professional and tender. "Hydrate," she said, half joking, wholly serious. Mary nodded and lifted the bottle like a promise. John waited until the space around Mary was breathable again. "Do you want me to call anyone?" he asked. "I can stay until you're to your building." She met his eyes, A.E. Steadiness returned that wasn't there before. "I'll call my daughter on the way," she said. "She'll talk my ear off until I get home." The idea warmed the edges of the moment, not to erase what had happened, but to situate it within a larger story, a journey that included science projects and grocery lists, and laughter that didn't require an audience. As the crowd thinned, the supervisor angled toward John with a half smile of acknowledgement that professionals trade when a citizen has been useful, without being reckless. "Good instincts," she said. He shrugged, uncomfortable with credit, just didn't want a bad lesson to stick. She nodded once and faded back into the city's current, the kind of guardian who leaves no headline and prevents more trouble than anyone will ever count. Mary adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced at the spot on the pavement that had nearly become a stage of surrender. Nothing marked it now, just concrete, ordinary again. That was, in its way, the lesson. Dignity can be restored to the same square of earth where someone tried to remove it. She tapped the silver pin with her fingertips as if checking that it was still anchored. It was. The wind lifted off the lake and carried the last scraps of tension away from the corner. Traffic blended into rhythm. A bus door wheezed shut. The street swallowed the scene and returned to what it had been, except for the invisible upgrades carried out in a dozen chests. John took a step back, enough to let Mary lead the next movement of her day. Richard's taillights receded into the stream, two small red eyes choosing distance over reflection. For now. And yet the story didn't stop at the curb. It never does. Moments like this travel, a quiet migration through the minds of everyone who witnessed them. They become prompts for better decisions at sinks and desks and dinner tables, for different kinds of leadership in rooms with closed doors, for a new mindset about what respect actually looks like when it walks down a city block. The recording the teenager kept would find its way into a few group chats, and maybe something larger. But even without a single view, the real impact had already settled. An internal ledger rewritten, a standard raised, a line remembered on a day when another line will be drawn. Mary lifted the water to her lips and took a measured sip. "Time to finish," she said, to herself as much as to John, not an ending but an orientation. He nodded and stepped aside, matching his pace to hers as they began to move, not to dramatize protection, but to accompany a person who had earned the right to finish her tasks without a shadow leaning over her. The city opened a path, the way it sometimes does when enough people decide that a small piece of it should be better than it was 5 minutes earlier, and the next turn in this journey waited just ahead, where apologies might yet be offered, where consequences might ripple, and where the lesson he tried to force would meet the lesson he could no longer avoid. The street had already swallowed most of the noise by the time Mary and John reached the corner. Cars moved again in their restless rhythm. People returned to their errands. And yet something invisible remained suspended in the air, a residue of truth that no amount of traffic could erase. Those who had stood in that circle carried the moment with them like a private note tucked into their pocket, a reminder of what they had witnessed and where they had chosen to stand. And in the silence that followed, the lesson was clearer than any speech could have made. Wealth may buy comfort, but it cannot manufacture respect, and it certainly cannot erase cruelty once it's been revealed. John walked a few steps beside Mary, saying nothing for a while. He understood that not every silence needed to be filled. Some silences were healing, the sound of dignity knitting itself back together. At last he said quietly, "You did more than you realize just by standing tall." Mary looked at him with tired eyes that carried both gratitude and disbelief. "I didn't feel strong," she admitted. "I felt like I was about to break." "That's what strength really feels like," John replied. "It's not the absence of fear. It's choosing not to surrender even when surrender would be easier." His words weren't polished like slogans. They were lived in, carrying the weight of someone who had seen resilience in its rawest form. As they moved forward, Mary's thoughts wandered to her children. She imagined telling Emily about what had happened, imagined her daughter's wide eyes as she explained how strangers had defended her when she couldn't defend herself alone. For the first time in years, she considered that her children might see her not just as the woman who carried every burden, but as someone whose worth was undeniable, even to strangers. That realization felt like transformation, subtle but powerful, a shift in mindset that whispered, "You are more than the sum of your struggles." Richard's retreat still lingered in her mind, though. The sight of him slipping into his car, defeated but too proud to admit fault, was a sharp contrast to the lesson he had tried to impose on her. He wanted to teach obedience through humiliation, but the hidden truth was that he had become the student, forced to learn, whether he admitted it or not, that power without compassion collapses under its own weight. In his downfall was a message written for anyone who mistook wealth for worth. True authority is measured not by how many people bow to you, but by how many lives you choose to lift up. John sensed her thoughts drifting there and added, almost as if reading them aloud, "Men like him think power is about control. But the real kind of power is what you saw tonight, the power of people stepping in, the power of kindness when it's needed most. That's the kind of power that actually changes the world." His tone was steady, not grand, but the impact of his words reached deeper than volume ever could. The crowd had dispersed, but fragments of their presence lingered. The teenager who had recorded the scene would later replay it, not for clicks, but for clarity, showing it to friends as proof that courage doesn't always wear a cape. The nurse, Alana, would tell her co-workers about Mary's strength, planting seeds of empathy in conversations over break-room coffee. Even the delivery driver, hardened by long shifts and tired nights, would carry a quieter patience into his next interaction, remembering the woman who asked for nothing but respect. These were the behind-the-scenes ripples, invisible but alive, spreading outward like concentric circles in water. Mary gripped the bottle of water in her hand and took another sip, slower this time, as though reclaiming even the smallest act as hers. "I didn't know people still cared like that," she said softly. John smiled faintly, his eyes on the path ahead. "Most do. They just need a moment to remember it." Tonight was that moment. The city stretched around them, filled with its usual contradictions, billboards advertising luxury across from soup kitchens, limousines idling near bus stops. Yet, after what had just unfolded, those contrasts didn't feel like abstractions. They felt like a call, a reminder that kindness and cruelty coexist in every block, and the decisions people make, small, fleeting, seemingly insignificant, are what tilt the balance. One stranger choosing to speak can change the course of someone else's entire journey. Mary thought again of her daughter's question from weeks ago. How do you stay strong when life isn't fair? For the first time, she had an answer. You stay strong by not giving away your dignity, even when others try to take it. And sometimes strength means letting someone else stand with you when you can't stand alone. She didn't say it out loud, but the realization filled her chest with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. John's pace slowed as they approached her block, letting the moment breathe. He knew she didn't need saving, she never had. What she needed was the reminder that her worth wasn't tied to anyone's paycheck, anyone's command, or anyone's arrogance. The truth is, he said, his voice low and reflective, wealth fades, power shifts, reputations change. But the way we treat each other, that's what lasts. That's the legacy every one of us writes day by day. Mary didn't reply immediately. She let the words settle, like soil accepting rain. The lesson wasn't about Richard anymore. It was about her, about John, about the crowd, about every person who would carry this story into their own private lives. It was about understanding that courage isn't always loud and kindness isn't always dramatic, but both can alter the trajectory of someone's life in an instant. She glanced at John one last time, her expression softening into something between relief and resolve. "Thank you," she said. But the gratitude wasn't just for him. It was for the strangers, for the city, for the fact that even in a world that often forgets its humanity, tonight had reminded her it was still alive. The lesson lingered in the air like a quiet echo. True power lies not in wealth, but in the decisions we make when another person's dignity rests in our hands. And as Mary stepped forward, reclaiming her path, the journey of this night was far from over, carrying with it ripples that would spread further than anyone standing on that sidewalk could have imagined. And if you've walked with me through this whole story, maybe it stirred something in you too. If it did, I'd love for you to let me know down in the comments with a simple line, something like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." It's always powerful to see how these stories land with each of you. And while you're here, a quick tap on the like button helps me keep bringing you more moments like this, the ones that remind us of the strength hidden in everyday lives. If you want to stay close to stories that carry these lessons, make sure you subscribe. You'll always have a seat in this conversation. And since the journey doesn't really end here, there's another video waiting for you right on the screen. It continues along the same thread, and I'd love for you to click and join me there.